Naomai haere mai. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the dinner last night and the conference yesterday. It was a great bunch of diverse topics, and so we've got a really excellent lineup for you today as well. I'm not going to say very much. I'm just going to get going with the conference. So I'm going to hand over to Janet Stevenson, who is one of our the steering group members of the Otago Energy Research Centre, and she's going to introduce our keynote speaker. Janet.
Kia ora koutou. Well, the keynote speaker today, Malcolm McCulloch, is really a long-term friend of the University of Otago, and particularly with respect to the energy cultures research and the green grid research, where he was one of our international collaborators for both projects. And Malcolm has, I think, a special place in our heart as being someone who presents as an engineer, but in fact is what I might call a polymath, a man of many parts, a man of enormous heart, and a man who has a real concern about the nature of the transition to a low carbon future. He's at Oxford University. He leads the energy and power group at that university, and is also a fellow of Christchurch College, where he has once memorably hosted me at the high table there, which was a very special event. He is an extraordinary man. He has undertaken a lot of very technical research, which has spun out a number of companies and I think 30 patents or patent applications for different innovations. But much wider than that, he has interests in the low carbon transition of a decentralized grid in both developing countries. He does a lot of work in Africa in that respect, and also developed countries. And in addition to that, he has wide public engagement within his own hometown and more widely across the UK. And he has developed something called Tipping Point, which is an annual event that brings together artists and climate scientists as an annual occasion to discuss the contribution of the arts to the transition. So across all of those fields, Malcolm is an amazing contributor. I don't know how he finds time in his day to do all he does, including all the publications and teaching, I think over 250 publications as well. But what Malcolm is really going to talk to us about today is an idea that he sparked our thinking of in the Energy Cultures Project years ago, when he started talking about a fractal grid. And this really was like, what do you mean by fractal grid? And it's one of those ideas that kind of resets how you think about something altogether. And so we invited Malcolm to give this keynote on the topic of the fractal grid. That is how we can see the grid in a very different way through a fractal perspective. Malcolm, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'm sure it'll be an absolutely fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Hi, Janet, thank you for those kind words. I've now come off mute. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, Malcolm, your screen's clear and so are you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Let's start off with it's thinking about distributed energy sources and a fractal grid approach, but I'm also going to be talking about the way we do transitions, the way we think about complex problems, and some other fun stuff. So I actually do something unusual. I'm going to start off with the key insights and to say, this is what I hope to get out of this presentation, and hopefully you will get the same insights that I've come over time. The first one is that the nature of the grid is changing. It's no longer just moving energy in space like we used to think about it, taking, energy from generation to load, but it's also now moving it through time. So it's generation at time A and using it at location B at time B. So that's the first one. The second one is that we've got a quasi-fractal nature. In other words, we have multiple scales, but each scale has very similar properties. And the question now becomes, how do you link those properties within the scales and how do you work with that? The third one is to say that the operation of grids and the transition to the new zero carbon grids not only involves grids themselves, but actually the whole infrastructure around buildings and mobility come along as well, which makes life a little bit more interesting. And then the last one I'm going to pick up on is to say this becomes a really complex problem. And the question is, how do we actually manage that complex problem? And we developed an approach called lean transitions, which we'll finish off the talk with. Some of you who've known me and seen me before and you're wondering what's happened, I always start asking an interesting question. So my first interesting question is, when do you expect global sales of electric vehicles to exceed that of ICE vehicles, in other words, traditional vehicles? So this is a global market, and it's just sales. It's not saying the total stock of cars, but just when do sales take over? And what I suggest you do is talk to the person next to you, say hello if you don't know them, and discuss. And you've got 30 seconds of my valuable time to discuss the question. Off you go. So hopefully you're starting to get some ideas, and you might be thinking 2030s, 2040s, maybe even 2050s. But as usual, I don't give the answer straight away. You'll come later on the presentation. This becomes relevant, and I'll answer it then. So let's think about the way our power system has developed. This is Didcot Power Station, which used to be quite close to us. And you can see basically it's a large power-fired coal station. And on the left, you can see here is a large heap of coal. And that basically provided us with energy storage. And we could basically run the grid very simply. And we could conceptually think about it as that we have our generation. We move the energy through space to our load. And then basically we collect the money from our customers and we send it through a retailer back to cover off the network services and to come off the generation. And that world there was fairly complex, but it's we can see that the world we live in now is going to become even more complicated. And the reason for that change is because we have realized that our atmosphere is actually pretty thin. And therefore, the amount of CO2 that we're putting in is now starting to become significant. And so we're having issues around climate concerns and how do we manage that? And so the typical response is now to do this, which is to basically pull down a lot of the coal-fired power stations. And so we're transitioning away from coal-fired power stations. And what does that mean? Well, where are we getting our energy from? Well, in a lot of places, we're now finding that we're getting it from solar and from wind, but also from large-scale hydro for those countries that are blessed with hydro, which I know New Zealand is one of those. So we might think very simply is that what we can do is we can basically change our coal-fired power stations and our gas-fired power stations, swap them out and just simply replace them with wind turbines and other renewable energy sources, and everything remains the same. The challenge that we have, and especially in the UK and in Europe, is that it's not just we're changing that, we're actually getting rid of other systems, such as our oil-based systems and our fossil gas-based systems. So we now find that the electrical system has got not only changing its needs in terms of the generation, but also what it's actually developing, what it's powering. And so we're getting new loads around air conditioning, new batteries coming through, new types of new electric vehicles are coming through. So whereas in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a gradual decline in the load, we're now starting seeing that changing. We've gone through an inflection point, and we're going to be having a significantly increased amount of load that we have to bear. And you might want to think, well, surely this is just a gradual change. We don't need to worry about that. We can manage that change reasonably well. So this comes back to my question, which is, when do you expect global sales of electric vehicles to exceed ICE vehicles? And indeed, if the answer is in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s, we're okay. However, data we've been collecting over the last few years shows the transition is a lot faster. We can see here the orange dots are actual real data, and we fitted an S-curve to it, and we can see the transition point is looking like it's going to be 26, 27. So this is the total global sales of electric vehicles are going to overtake on traditional vehicles, looking like 26, 27. That's not decades away, that's 3 or 4 years away. That's a scary prospect, because you can see the ramp, the ramp coming up is going to be significant, and the question is, how do we manage that? I'm aware that markets like yourselves are going to be a bit slower than that, and also you can say that this is just new sales, and it takes about 10 to 20 years for the whole stock to change over. But what I'm really trying to show with this figure is to say that globally, the transition on electrical power system is going to be a lot faster than a lot of us anticipating. And if it goes fast and we can't actually make the changes at an appropriate speed, we're then going to land up with things that look like this, which is not what any of us, the power engineers, would hope to see, and none of us, the rest of us, would like to see happening. On top of that, we're also having to deal with not only increased load, but also the variable nature of the generation. And so what we need to do is we need to amend our diagram significantly to say that actually we now no longer just need to move the energy through space, but we also need to move it through time, either because we need to manage our transmission systems a lot better, so by putting batteries on either side, or because we got a variable nature within the solar and wind resources, which we're going to have to manage a lot better. So this means now that actually the nature of our grid, where we started with a relatively simple diagram, now becomes a lot more complicated, because we've got to manage the time and the temporal elements. And we hear terms such as flexibility or balancing is now becoming much more important. And in fact, the balancing market in the UK now is greater than the energy market. But not only that, because a lot of these resources, such as photovoltaics, don't now have to be on the large scale, it can be a much smaller scale, we find this transition happens at multiple scales. So we start off with looking at the hyperlocal scale, which is basically the individual house or a small neighborhood, typically behind the secondary. Then we're looking at the local scale. Also, we're seeing transitions happening there. That's basically in regions. National scale, it's definitely changing. And even, some of you might have come across that at the global scale now, there's also ideas of saying that actually, multiple plans together to look at, to say, how do we create a global grid that connects everybody? To make you aware, the ideas of global grids are very in the nascent idea, it's still nascent, and there's a lot of geopolitical challenges with that. But we do some work which actually shows that there's some real strong economies of being able to do this global grid, and we may well start to see the first pieces of those coming through in the next 10 to 20 years. We're already seeing, for instance, the link between the UK and Morocco has recently been approved, and the X-Links project is starting to put a cable in the sea in the next year. They raised the finances, and that's going ahead. So we can see that now our energy system used to basically be at the national scale, especially in terms of generation, but now we're looking at multiple scales that we have to take account of. And this is where the concept of a fractal grid comes into mind. This is the original idea about that, because a fractal we can think about is something that has, if you look at something like Pythagoras' tree, we start off with a single square. We then add two, we make an isosceles triangle, and we put two squares on the edges of that. So we now have a pattern, and that pattern now repeats at different scales. And so we start to build up a much more complex system, but at each scale you're looking at, the properties remains the same. So no matter whether we're looking at this scale here or that scale there, there is a similar property or rule that follows all the way through. Pythagoras' tree is really small, a simpler one, but if you look at something like Mandelbrot sets, you'll see the same thing. Although there's not a governing function, the underlying properties at each scale are very, very similar. So the question is, what would be the appropriate scales to look at for the power system? And the way I kind of think about things is to say, we can look at a national scale, which is a geographic scale, and then an electrical scale would be the transmission network. For us, it tends to be 400 kV, but in different countries, you can go anything from 200 to a megavolt as the basic transmission, then the backbone, and that's at a very large scale. We then come to the grid supply point, which is within a region, and we find that we now go through a transformer and we come down to the next level down, which is, say, for instance, a bulk supply point, where you're looking at 132 kV. Those then branch out into many ones, and we then have a particular locality or a community, which is looking at the primary substation, and that's coming in at about 11 kV. Again, that could be anything from 33, 22, or 11, but that typical voltage level. Then we start to get to the hyperlocal, where we're looking at a particular community, and that's looking at 400 volts and the secondary substation. And that then comes through and supplies each individual house, which is at the 240 volts or 220 to 240, depending on what your underlying system is. So we can already start to identify 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 scales. But of course, you can go further into the transnational scale up there, or you could look, say, for instance, within a particular room. Again, you can change these scales. But unlike a fractal, there are not an infinite number of scales. There are a finite number of scales, and that's why I kind of call it a quasi-fractal grid scale. But it is kind of useful to think about this in terms of the particular properties that you might want to have at the various scales. And then the question is to say, how do we actually realize them at those individual scales? And also, more importantly, how do we connect them at those various scales? So I'm going to start off with looking at one particular, there are two properties I'm going to look at. One is operations, the other one is planning. So if we start with operations, we can think about, okay, what are the properties of the different types of loads and generation that we have at the different scales? And a simple one to think about is to say, okay, we've got variable generation, which is basically looking at solar and wind, but you also might have fixed generation in there, or dispatchable generation, which you could think of as something like hydro. Although when you look at a long time scale, hydro becomes variable as well because of the changing nature of the rainfall that comes on and that's available to it. The second property we look at is what we call must-run loads. Those are loads that have to supply their service instantaneously or immediately, and there's no storage built into them, either storage of the energy or storage of the service. And so we have must-run loads that have to be powered immediately. We then have the third category, which is flexible loads. And flexible loads are those that we can adjust and run them at slightly different times to provide services at a different time, or there might be some storage involved so that we can actually have the service at the time that we need it, but the energy used to power it can be delayed. And this obviously leads us to demand response, allows us to do demand response. Then you can think of storage, and this might be storage of electrons, such as in batteries, but it also could look at hydro at a national scale. But also something you could think of if you're generating water by reverse osmosis, you can actually store the water is another way of storing the energy. The most typical one that we use is thermal storage in buildings, which allows us to modulate the supply and use the thermal storage to deliver the comfort levels that we desire. And the last one is to say we need to have some kind of control which actually manages and balances out the different requirements of the energy use within that particular level. So I'm going to take the example of a home and work through where homes are moving to and what a future home might look like and what some of the aspects of that. So if we look here at a typical home, if we look in terms of variable generation, we can see we got a solar generation, there's a solar PV sitting on the roof. A must-run load may well be something like a TV, is that you want to sit and watch the TV straight away. You're not going to delay watching that sports game. You want to run it there and then. Although some people might say things like service demand and the good old DVRs allow you to delay that operation. But on the whole, I consider that as a must-run load. Then we can look at something like a flexible load, which might be something like a hot water tank, which you want hot water at a particular time, but because you're storing the thermal in there, it allows you to adjust when you actually turn the heating on for that particular load. And then we've got storage, and I'm thinking particularly of storage. So if they're looking at something like the Tesla Powerwall, we can actually have a battery storage in the home. Those are now starting to become popular, especially in combination with solar PV here in the UK. And then the last thing that we need to think about is how do we actually do the smart bit of controlling everything. And we talk about HEMS, or home energy management systems. Those are now becoming quite popular in order to try and work everything together. But one of the challenges that we've now finding, and a lot of people are finding, and I'm sure you'll be doing the same, is actually the interoperability between different manufacturers is not great, and therefore HEMS is actually quite difficult to actually manage. So that's our kind of smaller scale is the home scale. And so what you might want to think is, okay, what's the next level up? And we said that was going to be the hyperlocal. We can also think of that basically, for those of you from the lines companies, you can think of this as the loads behind a secondary substation. And once again, we can accumulate all the variable generation that we had from the individual homes. But sometimes we also might have a small PV plant sitting there, or a local wind turbine, especially if there's a local industrial plant that might be sitting there. Must-run loads, again, are things like street lighting, although we're starting to look in Oxford of making them flexible, especially after midnight, to say, can we actually use them less and use them smarter? Storage is becoming a interesting proposition, and we're looking at either DSO or lines companies' own batteries located at the secondary substation, but also community-level batteries are also starting to emerge. And then the last thing we're looking at is, what are the controls? How do we actually modulate not the individual's behavior, not only for their own benefit, but also for the benefit of the whole group? And I've just spent the whole day looking through a proposition of creating a smart community energy system, or a SCES, where we can enable not only local energy trading, so that means that people's PV can use other people's batteries, and so therefore we can use the utility a lot better. But also we can look at the minimizing the power in the system. Managing the voltage levels in the system. The next level that you might be looking up is say, for instance, the city or regional level. And again, here we might have, especially if it's regional, we might have some significant solar and wind farms that we need to connect at that kind of distribution level. One of the big must-run loads that we're struggling with in the UK is charge point operators, in other words, large EV charging. And this is looking at particularly for the rapid chargers or the ultra-rapid chargers, where each charger might be up to 300 kilowatts, and you might have 10 of them at the same place. So you're suddenly getting a 3 megawatt load dropped in one location and sucking up all the capacity. The other side is data centers are starting to emerge rapidly everywhere, and they are also consuming a lot of the capacity in the system. And both of those have to be operating when they need them. We're seeing a significant increase in the flexible loads, especially industrial centers are now starting to change their manufacturing programs so that they can actually use their high energy processes, such as paint rooms, in times of lower energy prices. And we're also seeing commercial buildings starting to modulate their heating and cooling requirements. At the regional level, we've also had a successful program looking at a grid supply point connected storage. This is a 100 MVA, a 50 MVA battery with a 1C rating, and that has proved to be extremely profitable and is now being, most grid supply points are now having one of those connected in the UK. And the way we control it at the regional level is one of the ideas that is under consultation at the moment is to look at nodal locational dynamic pricing, So in other words, every region will have a different price at a different time interval to try and manage the loads appropriately. And then the next level up is looking at the national level, and this is where we get the large offshore wind farms having to come in. We've got the new nuclear station coming through. We have a number of critical muster and loads at the national level, including things like electric trains, but also new industries such as battery manufacture, where if you have any time where the power is not running, you get significant issues. So the value of lost load is really high in that sector. But we're also getting more flexible loads. So our water system consumes a significant percentage of the national energy. And so that's now becoming a lot more flexible. And that's providing some really useful demand side management capabilities. And we're starting to, although this is early days, we are starting to look at to see how do we do interseasonal storage, either through things like compressed air and power to gas, and the reverse of that. The compressed air at the moment using salt caverns to store the compressed gases there's some early trials that have started here in the UK. And the last thing that we're starting, the way that we actually manage things is through a balancing market, and we now most balancing markets around the world started off at the 30-minute level, so every half hour you balance the market. But as we're getting more variability, we're seeing it drop down to, say, for instance, the 5-minute balancing market, such as happening in Australia. And we're also starting to look at to see how we can actually decrease our balancing market time intervals to 5 minutes. So that shows you that actually, in terms of operation, we've gone everything from at the household level all the way through up to the national level. But the features of variable generation, must-run load, flexible load, and storage and control, they're all common across those multiple levels. And so now the challenge becomes to say, how do we not only ensure they work well at the level that they're found at, but also how do they play well with scales that are greater than them or scales that are lower than them. And this is one of the big challenges we're busy working on at the moment. But it's not just operations where we can think of using quasi-fractal ideas. We can also think about in terms of planning, and especially the transition that we're going through. And one of the things that's becoming really clear is that as we think of transitioning the electricity system, we recognize that because of the change of heat from gas through to electric, especially in this country, and the move from petrol and diesel through to electric transport, means that we've now actually got 3 co-evolving infrastructures. And how do we manage the transition in all 3 so they happen at the right pace, at the right time, at the right pace and the right scale, so that we don't crash one of those infrastructures because of inadvertent plays in the other. Way we could think about this, the last one was a bottom-up approach. This one I'm looking at a top-down approach. So we can start off by thinking about what is the national level, what is our net zero strategy. This is often done by governments. And they could be looking at those 3 particular sectors. We can say, for instance, in the building sector, they're looking at how do we develop new net zero building regulations. They're also looking at incentive schemes for everything from charge points for domestic use all the way through to heat pumps. At the transport sector, we're looking at what is the transport strategy supposed to look like for the UK, and especially around linear infrastructure. I'm sure most of you must have come across the debacle around HS2. So linear infrastructure is basically infrastructure that goes over long distances, and rail infrastructure and motorway infrastructure falls into that particular category from the transport sector, and again is proving really challenging. And how do we manage that? And then on the third sector is around electricity. We're re-examining what markets, what are the appropriate markets. We're doing a massive market reform investigation at the moment, and also looking at the pricing. How do we change that? For instance, we're putting a lot of, where there's talk now putting our social charges, we're moving them from the electrical system through to the gas grid system to try and adjust to enable people to move over to electrifying their electrifying their loads. We're also looking at regulation to say how that might change as we go forward. At the city and regional level, we're now looking at developing local area energy plans where we're taking a holistic view around buildings, transport, electricity. This is exciting because we're now bringing together stakeholders that normally never worked with each other in one room, and actually starting to identify what are the objectives of that particular local energy plan, and to say, how does that interact with things like building plans? How do we identify retrofit zones where we can get benefits of scaling up? And we're interacting with that, things like transport plans, thinking about travel strategy, which is promoting active travel. How do we look, what's going to happen with public transport and then private transport, especially as we start to increase the amount of EV charging infrastructure, because a lot of the homes don't have to have on-street parking, and that interacts with the transport infrastructure. And then lastly, around electricity, is that one of the things that a lot of the networks are doing is trying to proactively identify new demand that's coming on board, such as charge point operators, large charge point operators, new industrial processes, data centers and the like. And now they're having to change their process, and rather than people come apply to them, they want to get a 5-year or 10-year head view of what's coming through, so they can start to plan for the system change. And that comes under a thing called DFES, which is distribution future energy scenarios, and that's been developed to help make the planning a lot easier across the larger scales. And then we come to the much more local level. Again, so I think behind the secondary, we're doing quite a lot of work now where we're working with communities to identify what do they want for their communities, what are their requirements in terms of buildings, what's the needs assessment. Are we going to be looking at heat networks where you need multiple people to play together? Or we're looking at heat pumps, what is the impact of noise, all those types of things. And then around transport, what does the local transport infrastructure and the electricity infrastructure start to look like? And especially looking at the impacts of, say, local storage and generation. And then the big one that everybody's starting to talk now is to say, actually our existing infrastructure, especially at the secondary level and below, does not have the capacity in it or the ability to actually support a fully zero carbon energy transition. The question is, how do we actually manage that without having to dig up every road in the city, or every road in the UK, because we basically have an underground electrical infrastructure. The question is, how do we stage that? And if we look into transition over the next 7 to 10 years, we simply don't have the capacity to be able to do it. So the question is, how do we delay and solve that? And then within the individual homes, we're now developing a process with retrofit works and low carbon hub, where we're actually doing a future fit whole house plan, where we're actually saying, okay, given the what the community wants, now we start to look at individual homes, and can we plan for building, transport and electricity, and put together a whole house plan to say that we can take individual steps, and together they work synergistically together to get to the final one. The last thing I wanted to pick up on is to say we got really complex types of problems that we're trying to work with. And so I just wanted to say 2 things about how do we classify problems, and we can see this is a really complex problem. The first one is to say we need to understand what type of problem we've got, and basically that we got the classic Boston Square, where on the verticals we got external context, which is either very slow changing, which has been typical for lines companies. If you look, say, between the 1950s and the early 2000s, very slow changing. We're now moving to a much more faster changing environment, and how do we manage that? And then the internal context to say, are we reactive? Do we just respond to problems, or are we proactive and try and seek out improvements proactively? And this basically says that if you look at the 4 zones, we had to talk about clear. This is where it's slow changing and reactive. We have imperceptible change. The complex space is where we proactively go and improve things, so we're having incremental change. The complex space is where we're saying, okay, we recognize transitions are coming, and let's make some, let's proactively go out and understand what those transitions are and how do we work with. And then the last space is to say, actually, we start in a clear space. We think we're in a slow changing environment. It's actually fast changing. And therefore, we are forced to make transitions, or we collapse because the business models and our processes are no longer fit for purpose. This little center one is basically confusion, where we say we don't know which space we're in and how do we manage, how do we identify what space we're looking at. And so typically we can see that the four spaces are either we have known knowns, known unknowns. In other words, we can analyze our way out. We have unknown unknowns, or the chaotic space is basically where we have unexpected unknowns, where we do the processes, but the results come out as unexpected, and therefore we know we're in problems. So in the four spaces, we know what procedure to follow, what analysis to perform. This is the space that we do a lot of work in, is to say, how do we reveal what the unknowns are? And how do we do that without collapsing the system? And then the last one is to say, how do you survive the change? And that's becoming an interesting space that a lot of companies are starting to work through. So the question is, how do we manage that? And so what we do is we use an iterative approach to try and manage, to reveal and to manage the unknown unknowns. And the idea is you start simply, and then you increase the scale and complexity as you start to understand the environment a lot better. And so we developed a system where we basically have something similar to the lean startup process, or minimum viable products, which some of you may know. We start off with bringing key actors together to understand what is the societal need that we have. An example is for our Leo, Project Leo, where we were creating a flexibility market. We brought all 8 different stakeholders together that included the local authorities, key customers, the lines companies, and we brought them all together to identify what did we say the societal need that we were actually trying to achieve was. The next thing we did was we developed a theory of change to say, what are we going to do, and how do we take that, how do we actually make that happen? And the way we did this is our very first version. We had a very simple theory of change, which says we're going to create a flexibility market that enables flexibility to come forward, which means we can put more distributed energy resources in the system. The version that we're working on now is much more complicated, and this is a whole systems approach, a systems diagram approach, which allows us to actually understand that transition a lot better and who the key actors are and what are the key decisions they need to make. But that theories of change then allows you to identify what is the minimum viable system you need to create. And it's basically who are the fewest number of actors, and those are the essential actors, to create a system and to try and implement it in the easiest way. And we think of a manual process is the simplest way to go forward. And the idea behind this is to say we need to start to see what are the interactions between the different components in the system and how do they work well, and what are the things that we never expected, and how do we manage that? So for us, we basically said our minimum viable system is that we were going to provide an auction for the flexibility, and then we're actually going to run the flexibility, and we identified our alliance company, the DNO, a SME platform to provide the marketplace, and then the flex provider were our 3 minimum actors that we needed, and we ran that. And so the interesting thing was it took us 3 weeks to actually run the first MVS from a clear start. And in that, we basically monitored the key performance indicators and also understand the processes what were happening. And the idea is to try and understand the failures. Where did things not work, so that we could just start to uncover what are those things that we didn't properly understand about the system, and what are those unknown unknowns, and how do we manage them? So here's my colleague Adriano working at a local battery storage facility at our bus operator. And the reason he's sitting on the phone, because something went wrong. And so we recorded all the events. And so we went through this learning phase to actually work out what the heck went wrong. And what we realized was that the battery couldn't actually do what we were looking for. So we were delayed by about 10 minutes. And the delivery period was in half an hour. And so the question was a 10-minute delay actually important or not? And so we then went to look to say, okay, how do we improve our theory of change? How do we adapt things? How do we adapt a minimum viable system? And the thing we needed to adapt was to say, actually, we can't just have a flat rate to provide flexibility. Our flexibility has to be dependent on the amount of delivery that was actually performed within that time period. So we then said, okay, anything up to 95% to 110% was fine. You got the full amount. and then you get the scales going down. But if you only deliver 50% of the flexibility, or anything below that, it was deemed to not have done at all, because we found that that meant that we had to effectively double the amount of flexibility offered, and that became really costly. So over 2 years, we basically ran multiple NVSs, and we started to scale up and up and up. And what's exciting is that, the slide's a little old. We managed to procure 500 kilowatts of zero carbon flexibility resources. I was talking to the guys yesterday. Last week, they procured 2.5 megawatt hours of flexibility. Again, all zero carbon flexibility, which is pretty impressive. So to conclude, the nature of the grid is changing. It's becoming not just moving energy through space, but it's also moving energy through time. We also have multiple scales that have the same properties, and we term that as quasi-fractal. And the challenge is not only identifying what those scales are, but also to say, how do they interact with the scale above them and the scale below? And that's the real challenges that we're trying to uncover. We also seen that for the electrical system, that the operations and the transitions involve not just the electrical system, but now increasingly buildings and mobility. And so therefore we're having to change our processes quite dramatically to include a lot more actors in the room to make sure we can do that well. And the last point is to say that complex problems such as this transition needs a lean transitions approach, where you can iteratively go around, uncover problems, increase the complexity, and manage those unknown unknowns until you get to the final system. And that concludes my talk. Thank you all for listening to that.
Well, Malcolm, as usual, you've stretched my brain a little there. That was great. We have now, amazingly, about 25 minutes for questions, and I'm sure there's a lot of interest. And we're going to start with a question that's online. If you could read that one out for us, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is from Chris Lambourne. He says, hyperlocal DER, that's distributed energy resources, relies upon bidirectional electricity supply at the network demarcation point. Most 415 240 volt networks are not designated to have high levels of injection, and congestion occurs. Low voltage levels climb up and or over the sensors cut to the local injection. How fast should electricity networks redevelop networks to eliminate the congestion? And then should consumers be guaranteed a minimum injection of 3 kilowatts? So this is basically a solar PV problem. On the example that we use, so this is in sunny Britain, i.e. not very sunny Britain. We are having exactly this problem. And one of the things we're looking at to say is actually not that we have to increase the network size, but rather should we be looking at voltage management as part of the services that we can pay people to do. And so most systems that are inverter connected can be reconfigured to inject reactive power into the system to then manage the manage the voltage levels. And that is one of the things we're actually looking at, we're exploring at the moment, to say, how do we actually make that happen? One of the challenges we have is that most manufacturers set the default power factor to 1, and so therefore don't allow us to do it. But we're looking to say, actually, there are some manufacturers that you can change the power factor. And now the question is, how do we incentivize some of our users to manage that voltage? Because actually voltage is probably a bigger problem earlier on than, say, thermal limits that come in later. So really good question. And the answer is not straightforward, but there are some interesting approaches that we could take.
Right.
Hopefully that answers the quick request.
Right, over to the floor here. And also, if anybody online wants to ask a question, do pop it in chat or hold up your hand and we will find you and get you to ask the question.
Thank you very much. I'm interested. This is kind of, it may seem like a dumb question, but I don't think it is. But I'm interested in consumption, what role consumption plays in, I guess, the whole system that you've just presented to us, because we're looking at consumption of energy in the household at different levels. We're talking about consumption of products that require energy production. So I'm just interested in what your thoughts are around how we manage consumption, either reducing it in some places or increasing it in other areas to consume more energy efficient products or whatever. Yeah, I'd love to understand that aspect of it, please.
That's a nice, easy problem. Not. Yeah, it's actually a really good question, and it's not one that we're going to go forward. It's actually one of the side questions that I worry about a lot. If we roll ahead, say, 20 or 30 years' time, I think that our biggest problem, one of our biggest problems, is going to be resources and what resources we have to bring to bear to creating our culture that we're in. Be that things like indium, which is used as on all the glass sheets or all the mobile phones, because it's clear and it's still conductive and therefore allows you to do stuff. But it's actually an element that is not abundant and is one of the ones we're going to run out of relatively soon, all the way through to people talking about copper being more and more challenging. So my short answer is to say that I think we potentially will have more than sufficient energy in the future as we go to enhancing renewables and other technologies come through. I think that's not going to be the big problem. The big problem is going to be resources. So that means that we should be accelerating towards an economy where we, instead of going cradle to grave, we could doing cradle to cradle. So we're reusing the resources a lot better. And so now we're thinking about how to design products so that we can actually recover those precious resources in there. I mean, to give you an interesting statistic is of how bad it's got, is if you look at the platinum content on roads in London is actually higher than the platinum content in the ore that's being dug out of South African mines. And that's simply because the catalytic converters have a lot of platinum in them and they're not being designed well, and they get used and so the powder gets distributed on that. You also look at something like the gold content in some of the tips that people have thrown their rubbish into, tips, is higher than the gold content in a lot of the gold ores that we dig out of. So there's a whole new thinking to say that when our population, total, global population was in the billions, the low billions, we have plentiful resource, we could kind of be wasteful with it. But as we go forward, we have got to be a lot more frugal and a lot more careful in how we use it going forward. So that's kind of like a rambling answer to a really good question.
Sally.
Hi, Sally Brooker from Otago. Follow-up question in some ways from that, in that regards to storage, which is largely being shown as batteries in a lot of these sorts of presentations. Of course, they're very complex and contain a lot of different components, and recycling of those, as far as I'm aware, still got a long ways to go to really get good. Where do you see the role of storage, including interseasonal storage potentially, of chemicals, basically? So conversion of that excess electricity into hydrogen and value adds, liquids, whatever that's easier to store and then burn. It's part of a circular economy. I mean, I guess it's early stage, but just interested in your view of where that's at and where it could track.
Yeah, again, a really good question. So let's just deal with the batteries one first. One is there's a huge amount of effort going to look to say how can we recover some of those materials from lithium batteries, especially some of the more challenging metals. that's one track. The second track is sodium batteries are now starting to come through, and you might have noticed in the press in the last week or two that actually there's been some significant breakthroughs in terms of making a commercially viable sodium battery, and sodium basically comes in salts and sodium chloride. So it's an abundant metal that we could use. So that's on that side of things. If you look at the circular economy with hydrogen, if you look at green hydrogen, where you basically use electrolysis to basically produce the hydrogen and then come forward, the thermodynamics are against you energetically. So in other words, every time you go through another process, you lose a significant portion of that energy. And so if you do a complete round trip from electrons through to hydrogen, and then ammonia, and then back to hydrogen, and then you go back again, and you do the whole process, you're probably throwing away about 2/3 of the energy. Now, that's not a problem if your energy is really cheap and easy to get hold of, and you've got excess energy, that's fine. But if you don't have excess energy, then you've got a problem. My one small problem is that often people talk about saying, oh, okay, well, what happens if we've got a lot of wind or we've got a lot of excess energy? Can't we just do it at that time period? Well, the problem is that might only be 20% of the year where you can actually run your hydrogen plant. Now you've got a really complex, expensive plant only running for 1/5 of the time, and the economics don't stack up, at least not at the moment. And so you've got some challenges around the circular economy. I do think, however, that interseasonal storage will be mitigated through the trade of maybe some of those energy vectors. So if you're getting some of those hydrogen vectors being made in places which have an abundance of energy resource, such as in deserts, you might think of Australia as one place of doing that. You could then actually provide that resource, and then in the Australian summer, which then would be Europe's winter, and then suddenly you don't have an interseasonal problem anymore. And so if you look at global trade of these resources, then I think you can mitigate a lot of the interseasonal storage problems. But again, you just got to remember the thermodynamics are against you, so therefore the costs are challenging.
Great. Daniel, I think next.
Hi, Malcolm. Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if you might be able to draw some parallels with the energy system and with the internet, because a lot of the ways we're trying to address the challenges that we're facing around flexibility, around intermittency, around voltage issues, we're looking at markets and creating new markets. However, with the internet, we usually do that just through standards and protocols. And I was wondering, how much we need to look at market solutions to solve energy issues versus actually how we're designing and managing, how we're designing the technologies that are in the energy system.
Another great question. Yeah, so if you look at something like the TCP/IP protocol, which is basically the underlying protocol that runs the network, it's very clever in identifying where the right routes through the system is going to be, because it kind of sends out a packet and see how long it takes to get a response. But the one thing that a lot of people forget about is that while it's doing that, it's actually storing that content locally, and then it's finding the next route through. So the internet actually has quite a lot of storage involved in the transmission of data throughout the network. And you would say that actually a similar way we could do it is if we build storage alongside some of our transmission lines, that actually makes life a lot easier and gets the decongestion out. The main difference is that the cost of storage in the internet is significant, is almost insignificant compared to the value of the data that's been transferred. Whereas in the energy system, the value of the energy is significantly lower than the cost of the storage systems to put those in place. So therefore, it's quite difficult to think about using a model that just basically says, well, the suppliers will just do it. I have explored quite a lot of saying that rather than thinking of storage as a commodity where you trade the kilowatt hours, you could think of it as a capital expense, and then use other market mechanisms to actually enable that to happen. Because if you think about it, there is a market mechanism in internet, and basically that's the price that the carriers pay to do that. And that's very much you're paying for the capital of the equipment that was installed, and you don't see this kind of trading mechanism underneath it because it's not needed, because it's a capital play rather than commodity play. And so I would go along with you to say, actually, one of our market designs, we've got to think very carefully about which type of mechanism to reward investment is the most appropriate. Is it a markets play or is it a capital play? And I think we're still got quite a lot of work to do to find out which is going to be the most efficient way of doing that for society. I hope that helps answer your question, Daniel.
Great. Excellent. Yes, another question just here.
Hey, Malcolm, that's Michael from, I guess, from Germany. I have one question. I really like your idea regarding merging the three independent infrastructures, electricity, heat, and mobility now into an all unified system. Are there any lessons learned we could take from countries and areas where heating or air conditioning is already 100% electric? So at least two markets were already merged, and we now see maybe big or vast e-vehicle fleets. Are there any lessons learned we can take from there?
Yeah, so the lessons learned basically from what I've seen is that because they're electric from the get-go, both sides have been aware of the need for the other side. And so, for instance, you could see the air conditioners now, you know, if you're providing large air conditioning or heating areas, there's a strong dialogue between them and the provision of, say, for instance, the wires to be able to power that. And so, you know, when we're talking to my colleagues in Germany, we can see that interaction is quite strong. Whereas in the UK, we mainly gas-based for heating, and so therefore the people who provide heating never ever talk to the electricity providers, especially the alliance companies, and therefore they're just not used to talking to each other. And that's one of the things we're actually starting to do, is actually bring those different parties together. And then when you come to transport, it's even more disconnected. But for instance, one of the things I'm doing at the moment is we're actually setting up a forum where the charge point operators and the DNOs are actually now getting together in a room to share ideas of where they think the charge point operators should be, where can they go in the network, and the networks are now starting to open up to actually reveal some of their data of saying where is the capacity where they can put it in, which 3 years ago would have been unheard of. They said, no, it's strategically important information. We can't share that with anybody. Now they're starting to do it because they're recognizing, actually, if they don't, they just have a lot of connections process coming in. I mean, again, discussion I heard on last Friday, was that 5 years ago, our local DNO would typically get between 20 and 30 connection requests a week. Last week they had over 1,000, and they're getting 1,000 every week, and so their processors just can't cope with that level. So they're now having to think to say, actually, we need to be a lot more proactive and actually work through this a lot better. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. Right, Bill.
Hello, Malcolm. I was just wondering, I'd be very interested in your comments on the value of bidirectional charging on EVs on these sort of systems.
Yeah, so we've done quite a lot of work on this, and if you ask Janet to get my email address, then just ping me an email and I'll send you the papers on them. Bidirectional, okay, so let's sort of unidirectional, in other words, you smart charge when you're actually going to do things, provides a significant value, especially to the network side of things. So we showed that in the UK, that if we had a fully electric vehicle fleet, we would need to double the peak capacity required in the system. So go from something like 40 to 80 gigawatts is what we needed to do. However, if you were smart charging, you could actually get that down to just over 41 gigawatts, so a significant drop. So that provides a significant amount of value to that. What it doesn't do, though, is look at your inter-day balancing. And this is where I think there's a huge value to having bidirectional charging, where you can actually not just manage the network capacity, but also the variability of the system. And the numbers are truly immense. I mean, just as a, 2 years ago, I gave a talk to our parliament, and I said at that stage was 2024, which is next year, the size of the EV fleet in terms of capacity was going to be greater than our nuclear fleet. And people just wouldn't believe the numbers. And then I just walked them through a very simple calculations, and you could see jaws dropping because people didn't think of that. By the time we get to 2030, the amount of energy stored in electric, or the potential energy stored in electric vehicles, will provide 2 days worth of electricity for the whole of the UK. So the numbers are immense, and it shows, and the great thing is that the capital is being spent for mobility, not for storage directly. Therefore, it's a low long run marginal cost storage option, which if we could actually get mandated to have bidirectional charging, I think will save countries billions. So the short answer is yes. It's not that useful for managing network constraints. It's very useful for managing variable renewables.
Brilliant. Right, I think we have time for one more question over there.
I work for one of the local authorities in New Zealand. We have a bit of an issue in New Zealand with the ageing workforce. Has the UK addressed that, and do you have the workforce sorted?
Yes. Okay, again, a great question. Yeah, so the interesting thing, so the answer is we have that challenge as well, and also the alliance companies are really struggling with getting, or our DNOs are struggling with getting people through. And in May last year, we were opening up a new building, and I was sitting, I had a chat next to one of the directors of SSEN, which is our large grids company, and they were saying this is a problem. And I said, funny you should mention that. We run a master's in energy systems, and I do a 2-week course where we take people who are economists or mechanical engineers or environmental engineers. In the space of 2 weeks, we teach them everything from what a sinusoid is, all the way through to phasor diagrams, and all the way through to be able to design a basic network. And they said, you've got to be joking. And I showed them what we did within that course. And so September last year, we took 15 people who had graduated in a STEM subject, but none of them were electrical engineers. And we gave them a 2-week, we gave them a 3-week training course because we taught them some of the work they did. They then did another week's training within the company. And within 4 weeks, they were actively deployed on projects. And that team has now are behind the data gathering exercises required to gather what the future requirements around our charge point operators are. And they're also integrating that with doing load flows of the system so that within a space of 20 minutes, they can give a response to say whether a particular area can sustain that load or not. So what we've had to do, and this year we had 20 people going through. I've just been told they want 30 people next year to be able to go through that because they desperately need the young people to come through. One of the tricks we played was in attracting a group of really intelligent people was we made the advert really clear to say, we started with saying, do you want to make a difference in our move towards a zero carbon economy? And then we said, by the way, if you do, come join SSEN to help us actually do that on the touch field. And that really attracted a significant field of very talented people. The adverts they used to do was to say, come join SSEN as a power company, and that was seen as dull and boring. But as soon as we said, actually, you're helping the carbon transitions, that tied into the zeitgeist of the younger generation, and we attracted really strong people. So please feel free to use that trick as much as possible, because it is an important problem that we have.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm sure everybody here would have a question to ask Malcolm. That was such an incredibly stimulating and exciting presentation, Malcolm. I think you've taken our thinking a step further in respect of our collective energy future. And I think Malcolm has showed us, just by his presentations and his responses to questions, what a great thinker he is, how great he is technically, but also how committed he is to working with people from Parliament right through to his local lines company, right through to his local community, and actually making the change as well. Malcolm, you're an inspiration, and thank you very much from all of us.
Thank you, and I hope it goes well with the rest of your conference. And thank you for inviting me. It's been brilliant. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Now, I believe it's morning tea, and we regather at 10:25. Is that right?
Okay, could everyone take their seats again, please, and we'll get started. Okay, thank you. So I'd like to introduce our next keynote speaker. So we have Professor Elizabeth Wilson from Dartmouth College talking to us next. She's a professor of environmental studies and was the founding director of the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society. She now studies energy systems that are evolving in the face of new technologies, new social pressures, and new risks. And her work focuses on how energy and environmental policies and laws are implemented in practice. And her current research focuses on offshore wind energy, which is very relevant for us, and examines the gaps between policy goals and practice in different locations around the globe. So Elizabeth has given up half of her Thanksgiving dinner to be with us today. So a round of applause for Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be able to be here. And actually, my neighbors pushed dinner back a little bit, so I'm going to scoot out at the end, and I'll make it just in time for the main course. I wanted to thank everybody for the opportunity to be here and to talk to you on a topic that I think is absolutely fascinating, a development of a new, very complex industry, one that's happening around the world, and also now in New Zealand. I am here because of Inga Smith, who did her sabbatical at Dartmouth while I was at the Danish Technical University's National Wind Laboratory, where they have 400 people working on wind. Anything from the scientists studying the meteorological patterns around the world to the people thinking about the energy markets in society. And that's the group that I was with. I have studied how technological systems are evolving in relation to our societal goals and pressures, largely in response to climate change, but also other environmental pressures, as well as the changes in the politics, the institutions, and practice when we think about technologies. I first got interested in offshore wind. I'm currently in environmental studies department, but before that I was at a policy school at University of Minnesota. And let's see if I can get the slide to change. We have a law textbook that I co-author with some colleagues. And when I was doing the third edition, which came out in 2022, I appreciated in updating the section on offshore wind in the US that all of the projects were being financed by European investors. Now, this was curious for me because the US, as you know, has one of the largest banking sectors in the world. And it was interesting to see that all of the offshore wind development was happening with European money. So to further explore this project, we had a workshop at Columbia University in 2022, where we examined kind of the role of finance, of capital, this idea of offshore wind kind of fitting together in different types of systems. That first of those articles, this piece will be coming out in Nature Energy soon. It's embargoed now, where we talk about kind of the finance component. The important thing to remember here that is most renewables, unlike fossils, and this is this chart right here, the first figure, renewables are upfront capital intensive. So unlike fossil infrastructure, where a small bit of that will be determined by the capital costs up front, but most of the cost will be in the O&M, the operating and maintenance costs. Solar PV, onshore wind, offshore wind are front loaded capital intensive, and that makes things like interest rates that we're seeing today particularly important for these technologies. So the article that we just came out this week in Energy Research and Social Science on the grand challenges of offshore wind in the United States, where we pulled together practitioners and others and tried to understand this technology. And after doing those, my appetite for offshore wind was cooked. And in spending that year at the Danish Technical University Society of Markets Policy Group, I really began to appreciate, that offshore wind as a global technology has enormous potential. And its potential extends kind of beyond the technology to thinking about hard to decarbonize areas of the world where we have dense population centers and not much land. And the fact that this resource, this offshore wind resource, is incredible and globally spread, much better matched to populations than others. So IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Association, has very, very aggressive projections for what offshore wind development will look like. And I just want to point that at the start of 2023, there were about 64 gigawatts of offshore wind globally deployed, about half of that in Europe, mostly Northern Europe, and the other half in China. And yet the global pipeline, the aspirations for project, is over 425 gigawatts of offshore wind. So this is a technology that is globally going gangbusters and growing much, much more rapidly than many other initially anticipated. So the promise of offshore wind, you saw from the chart before, incredible offshore wind resources. The capacity factors are much, much higher than onshore wind resources, and oftentimes very complementary to other renewable resources like solar. Costs had been rapidly decreasing up until the current kind of round, the last few months. And the idea of this technology is that it can help us transform the electricity sector and much more. In Europe and other parts of the world, you see this technology also being planned for delivering green hydrogen, green shipping fuels, green ammonia and fertilizer. So really as a base scale technology, kind of gigawatt scale plants offshore that are being leveraged to decarbonize all kinds of other sectors as well. So just thinking about that for this technology makes it really interesting. This chart here is from an expert elicitation survey that was projecting the declines in costs from floating on onshore wind, onshore wind, fixed bottom offshore wind. That's most of the offshore wind technology that have been deployed to date, and then the floating offshore wind. So again, these perceptions of decreasing costs are a big part of how the industry is going forward. And these perceptions and this idea of a large renewable carbon-free technology at scale have meant that countries around the world are setting very, very aggressive targets for offshore wind. Here's a list of some in the paper that we're working on that accompanies this presentation. We actually have a few more countries as well. But you can see the column of the ambitions by 2030 versus what is operational today highlight both an incredible opportunity for development, but also a huge gap. And I think that is actually from a socio-technical system evolution, super interesting. And so when I'm thinking about these technologies and thinking about how they're going to be evolving over time, you think not only about what will happen, but also So I got to get back to here to drive it. What is challenging and where it's challenging. And so in this report, they only projected that Poland, Vietnam, and Denmark were forecast to meet their targets. I think that since then that it's actually gotten a little bit less for both Vietnam and Denmark. But again, that the optimism for this technology with the goals is something that's happening around the world. And so when you're thinking about how do you build an offshore wind plant, one of the pieces that comes up again and again and again, most important thing, just like with real estate, location, 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 here it's transmission, transmission, transmission. That is the most important factor for developing offshore wind. And I will just point out later, and I hope we can talk about it a little bit more in the Q&A session, that these challenges of accessing transmission have become real political points of contention, at least in the North American context. So once you have your transmission ideas, because if you build a plant but can't give it to the land grid, it's not too good these days, then you're looking at the good wind resources. You need access and rights to the offshore area and seabed for 30 plus years. There's always an environmental impact assessment that follows, although we'll see in the country case studies that we're examining, sometimes that's more rigorous than others. And you need to have a bankable project. The project needs to be able to pay back the loans. These are big, expensive projects. For a gigawatt, just order of magnitude, I'll use US dollars here. A gigawatt, you're looking at roughly 3 to 5 billion US dollars. So this isn't something that you're going to be financing on your, Kickstarter little campaign online. This is really large-scale capital finance for these very large-scale projects. And then, as this is a new technology that is incredibly complex, involving ports and infrastructures and new supply chains and maritime coordination with other users, you're looking for a developer's ability to run through complex, often duplicative, multi-jurisdictional regulatory processes. And this means that developing an offshore wind project usually takes roughly 7 to 10 years. This is a decade-long project. And I would like to highlight the fact that this long development time from start to end makes it much more similar in some ways to a large-scale nuclear project or big coal plant than our traditional renewable resources that can often be developed much more quickly. That brings with its own risks, as we'll see with some of the projects in the US that have kind of failed on their own ability to meet the contractual agreements they signed 4 or 5 years ago before interest rates and COVID and supply chain issues kind of made them sub-economic. So in practice, from a policy function, you're looking at how do I access transmission rights? This is necessary for any project. You're looking at how do I think about marine spatial planning in a world where we already have fishermen, oil and gas development in many parts of the world, shipping lanes and other users, military users often as well. How do we think about the environmental impact assessment? Who has standing, who is involved, how those processes are negotiated to manage these risks? In the US, I'm happy to take in the QA how some of these processes have been used by opponents of offshore wind, not necessarily from an environmental perspective, but to stop the development. And then the bankable project, how you're thinking about loans, whether you have project purpose agreements or a contract for difference. And there's all kinds of different policy mechanism tools to be able to get these projects off the ground. You're also thinking about the social license to operate. Denmark and many of the other Northern European developers talk about a one-stop shop where you go one place and then all of the development happens. In practice, in most parts of the world, it seems to be a little bit more complex with that, with a difference between national and jurisdictional. Is there a comment here? There's a comment from Chris. Chris, let's have that discussion at the end. I think this is a really good question to put out here because I think the New Zealand question is really an open one in terms of how it will work. But as a background here, I'm hoping this will help. So when we're thinking about the other things for offshore wind, those are what I need as a developer, but you're also going to need a supply chain, the ability to provide all of the different parts. In some countries like the US and in Taiwan, we've really put a lot of local requirements into the development of our supply chain. The workforce issue, these are workers that need to be trained not only to work onshore, but also offshore with the protections that are involved. The ports, the maritime infrastructure, the storage of large wind projects, and then thinking about how to work with this technology in new areas. Now, I just want to point out that the size and scale of these technologies is really not like those of you who've been familiar with the onshore wind turbines. It's a different story for many different reasons, but the size of the new turbines that are coming out are roughly the same size, the 15 megawatt turbines. This is one of the demonstration ones at the Oosteril site in Denmark. They're as tall as the Eiffel Tower. So they're 330 meters tall. This is roughly 3 times what you're seeing. And so it's a really different kind of infrastructure challenge going forward as well. And so that coordination is something that continues to be a challenge going forward. So the ports infrastructure, building it in the US, we have something called the Jones Act, where you can only use US built and licensed ships. And that's been causing some problems in our supply chain issues and causing some developers to cancel existing projects. And here again is that size and scale of turbines. One of the things that I think is very interesting is that what you see onshore versus offshore, today you're building a lot of projects with kind of that 10 megawatt size, but in the future that 15 megawatt size is already being tested, and they are having some challenges. And as the turbines have grown so quickly, you've needed bigger ships, you needed different port infrastructures, and that's been a real challenge for the industry as we've gone forward as well. When you look, this is from a website called 4C. And any of you who are interested in kind of the global development of offshore wind, it's an absolutely super website. And these maps that show the different projects around the world are fascinating. From the projects that are built, those are the green ones, to the ones that are being planned and the ones that are being permitted. But a lot of Europe, and Northern Europe in particular, has already been laid out for developing these and meeting these aggressive offshore wind goals. And indeed, the policy targets in Europe were really fueled not only by the Green New Deal, but also to the goals to reduce emissions by 40%. So with goals of building 60 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 300 by 2050, it's a real transformation of coastal areas around the entire EU. And so the European Green Deal in 2020 spurred that, but the war in Ukraine really made that energy focus even stronger. In the US, President Biden has set a goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030. We can talk in the break if we think that's going to happen or not. And 15 floating gigawatts by 2035, a technology that a lot of people are thinking can be transformative, but it hasn't yet worked as we're thinking it will work. Individually, all of the states have also established different goals. Many of the coastal states have established goals, and those add up to about 40 gigawatts. And then the Department of Energy puts out the offshore wind market report every year that details the progress in the industry going forward as well. In practice, what it means is that turbines require transmission. Turbines require ports. The industry requires the development of all kinds of other associated infrastructures if it is going to happen as it's planned. And when you're thinking about transmission, ENSO in Europe has already been talking about and planning how you can integrate the marine spatial planning with an integrated offshore transmission network. In the US last week, the Department of Energy just had a North American Atlantic transmission study that looks at developing the implications of, instead of going project point to point, having a larger transmission network developed offshore, what that could look like for the industry. That report will be released pretty soon as well. But how to pay for this infrastructure still remains a big question. In Europe, there are different countries with different approaches. In the US, it currently has been developer-led, possibly not leading to the most efficient solutions. And so one of the things that I appreciated on my sabbatical was that the potential of offshore wind, even in the US, is fantastic. I'm talking to you today from Vermont, where there is snow outside. It's right up here. I don't know if you guys can see the pointer. I'm about 2 hours north of Boston. And so the states have established so their amazing offshore wind potential here. When you're thinking about offshore wind in the US, on the East Coast, you could have a lot of the fixed bottom turbines, but the West Coast, because of the deeper waters in the Pacific, you'll be looking mostly at the floating technology. So while California has goals, it requires a completely different technological configuration and one that isn't nearly as mature. So here are the different renewable energy goals from the East Coast states, and then their offshore wind goals in megawatts. Now, how the states are going about procuring this is through this combination of policy mechanisms, using power purchase agreement, using offshore wind renewable energy credits, and in the case of Virginia, it's utility financing by Dominion Energy. But how they're going about it has really been interesting because there's been some lurching back and forth a few months that we could spend some time talking about as well. Here's the California goals. As I mentioned before, these are floaters. And then here's kind of where the different projects are now. I do want to mention that 2 of the New Jersey projects walked away last week, and 2 of the Massachusetts projects have also paid penalties of $48 million and $60 million to get out of their existing contracts, and they're rebidding now as they go forward. But this is what it looks like in practice on the East Coast, the different projects that are out there in the different areas. And the federal government, these are all in federal waters. The Bureau of Ocean Energy and Management are allowing these areas to be developed. This is offshore wind pipeline activity call areas. And the projects are happening there. There's also other efforts by the federal government in the US, floating offshore wind shot, that focuses the Department of Energy to focus on lowering the costs of offshore wind. And this is a picture. I told you the goal in the US is 30 gigawatts. This is a picture of 5 of the 7 turbines we currently have operating in the United States today. There are others now being built at Vineyard and South Fork, but up until now, we've had about 42 megawatts. And so this real gap between the aspirations of the country and the reality, I think, is something that people are very aware of and we all need to keep in mind. And one of the pieces you appreciate as you study this is the regulatory complexities. Here's a list of the people at the federal level, the organizations at the federal level, state level, and local level involved in any offshore development. And one of the pieces that I think is interesting as we think about all of this coordination, because as you know, each of these organizations, regulatory bodies, or city planning departments has their own set of priorities, own jurisdictional boundaries. And so that coordination has become a huge and very time-consuming piece of the development for offshore wind. Now, I just want to back up here because in the US, we have been extremely successful at deploying onshore wind. And so with about 145 gigawatts of onshore wind, you can see the different states with how much onshore wind has been there. Again, I want to point out that most of them are not on the East Coast, in part because the wind resources onshore on the East Coast are not as good. But it wasn't always this way. And I want to go back to thinking about how we've thought about onshore wind in the past. The annual energy outlook is put out every year by the US Energy Information Administration, part of the Department of Energy. And they project for the next 20 years what our mix of energy sources will be. So the annual energy outlook of 2000 had projections from 2000 to 2020. And normally when I'm in a group and I can see the audience, I don't know if you could turn the camera so I could see the audience there at OERC at the university. Can someone turn the camera around so I can see the audience? Okay, this is the quiz section of the, hi guys, the presentation. I'm just gonna ask you to raise both hands so I can see you. Okay, so the annual energy outlook of 2000 projected what that mix would be for the next 20 years. I told you we have 145,000 megawatts of power. How much, here's your question, how much did the 2000 annual energy outlook project? You have three choices. A is 800 megawatts. B is 8,000 megawatts, and C is 80,000 megawatts. Who thinks that they projected 800 megawatts? Raise your hand and then show me the room, please. Okay, a few 800 megawatts. Who thinks they projected 8,000 megawatts? So still several orders of magnitude too low. Okay, who thinks they got closer and we're at 80,000 megawatts? Say 80,000, C for 80,000. I wish it could have been 80,000 megawatts. It was actually A, 800 megawatts. So we, the experts who do all the great energy model, in this case it was NEMS, projected that between 2000 and 2020, 800 megawatts of new wind would be built. And this nice report written by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab afterwards that analyzed why that was so different, highlighted the fact that we had wrong ideas about the cost of the technology. We had assumptions built in on how much wind could be on the grid. If you had more than 20% wind, the theory was you'd collapse the grid. Now you have systems in the middle of the country that regularly run with over 50%, sometimes up to 70% wind, providing electricity. You had limitations on how much transmission would be built. And all of these, over that time period, changed. And so my hope for the future is that we, the experts, do not know what we're talking about. We're bounded by our conventional wisdom and thinking about how the world works today, and that there's huge hope in not only the future of what this technology can do, but where we can go forward as well. So I just want you to hold, as we're thinking about these systems, both in New Zealand but elsewhere, this idea of an evolution of a socio-technical system, where in the case of onshore wind, we had changes not only to the turbines themselves, but also to the control systems. We also had changes to the policies and incentives for local regulators in terms of how they sited, how things worked, financial comfort. The cost of capital has gone down and down and down over that time as financiers have gotten more comfortable with how wind is bankable and how it works in practice. And I think, and we've spent some time studying this, are the associated systems. When you go into any grid control room in the US, in the Midwest in particular, you have these huge weather maps that are real-time weather, that are making these predictions of what wind will be, not only in the next hour, but the next 24 hours, allowing wind to bid into the market and then true up its bid based on those estimations. You've had the grid operator behavior change, again with the control systems. Before I would call you up and say, dispatch down, and now it's all automatic. And so the other piece that has supported this is lots of new transmission. So I think at the start of any new industry, it's easy to look at the particular cases based on our past experience. But I think it's important to recognize that this is interdisciplinary, full-on play, and there are pieces that we're assuming are fixed now that are going to be changing in the future. And so my question for all of us when we're looking at offshore wind is how and why and what will be changing when. So the last year, while at DTU, I appreciated that the idea of how wind worked was often that it would work like it was in Denmark. And I don't know about you, but once you leave Denmark, the world doesn't actually work that way. So as part of my sabbatical, I went to these 4 countries in the Pacific region to try and understand how offshore wind development was happening. So through review of policy documents, regulation, interviews with practitioners, developers, regulators, academics, understanding their energy goal, and kind of that context of electricity demand growth. All of these countries have amazing offshore wind resources. They also all have a commitment to build and develop offshore wind. I will just say, you know, as a spoiler, the only one that's actually done it to date is Taiwan. And their rationale for doing so, as you can imagine, is often geopolitical as much as anything else. So I'll spend the next few minutes talking about these countries. I'll just do a brief overview, but I'm happy to bring it up because for me, this contextual political economy of offshore wind development is absolutely critical for understanding what system works in different places and how to tailor that system to actually allow for development of a technology like this or not. So this is part for me of a larger project, understanding the global economy. And in a place like Taiwan, which was the most advanced of the countries I studied, I appreciated how much work had to happen to allow for those first projects to build. And I mentioned before that context of energy security, but this is also a country where 98% of the fuel is imported onto the country, and how contentious the technology has become as well. There was a real hope that offshore wind would provide a new industry for Taiwan, in addition to semiconductors, to become a profitable industry. So there were lots of local content laws that were put on the development of these projects that would escalate with more development. That has proven challenging with workforce issues, with supply issues, and several developers have kind of walked away from the projects. But one of the things that is happening in offshore wind around the world, this is a chart that shows you the 2019 kind of map of different projects and who was involved. This is an international development. You have a lot of Taiwanese actors, but you also have actors from all over the world. And this mix of capital, experience, maritime expertise, and development of this industry highlights, I think in some nice pictorial ways, just the internationalization of this particular energy economy. In Vietnam, a very long, skinny country of about 95 million people, again, strong offshore wind resources, especially in the south of the country, where you have a lot of the industrial demand around Ho Chi Minh City. You have growing energy demand at about 10% a year. And that means that while the Prime Minister has declared net zero, if your energy is growing at 10% a year, that gap to fill is enormous. And so while there was a certain time when the goals of Vietnam were going forward apace and in part driven by the World Bank Group's offshore wind development map, this was really a donor-driven effort in some ways. And the idea was that the funding was going to be coming in the form of energy transition partnerships. In practice, it's become a little bit more challenging with some other components happening in Vietnam, with an anti-corruption campaign, removal of the president, and people being afraid to kind of have this industry go forward at pace. Transmission here also remains a problem. And today there's in development a possible offshore wind pilot project that combines the expertise of Électricité Vietnam along with Petro Vietnam. And so whether or not that goes forward, the idea was you'd have a safe development of a project going forward. And what struck me was that Vietnam seemed to be the one that would move the fastest. But then the Philippines, which also has strong offshore wind resources, not quite as many of the places for the development of fixed bottom turbines, and also driven in part by the country's desire to get off of fuel. But the Philippines is a country that has for the last 10 years been focusing on universal electrification. This is a place that, while it has 110 million people, a lot of them lacked access to basic electricity. And the geography of 7,000 islands makes supply very, very difficult. The weak energy and grid system mean that blackouts are common, and the high demand growth means that meeting those needs has been a challenge. And yet, in the Philippines, again, a World Bank-led report really has pushed the technology going forward. And led by the top, you now have very, very aggressive renewable energy projects. And today, 61 gigawatts of projects that have been kind of booked and planned. Now, I want to mention that this is happening without any marine spatial planning, without any clear process for EIAs. And it is a bit of a we'll figure it out as we go mentality. Whether or not that's going to work for international development, I think remains to be seen. But the enthusiasm is there, if not the expertise. I'll leave it at that. Many of you have more experience working in the Philippines than I ever will. Australia for me was an interesting country, and the only part of Australia that has an offshore wind goal is Victoria. And while the technologies, especially in the south, are very promising, the government is going ahead and declaring priority proposed areas around the continent. The only one that has been kind of finalized, the declared area here in the south near Victoria, and then one farther in New South Wales. So the goals in Victoria, 2 gigawatts by 2032, 4 gigawatts by 2035, and 9 gigawatts by 2040, for me were striking for several reasons. One is they assumed that it was easier to develop a whole new offshore wind industry from scratch than to build a transmission line to New South Wales or other parts of Australia. I mean, I know transmission is hard, and I actually see similar echoes of our development in North America. You know, it's easier to build offshore wind industry than to do the transmission infrastructure. But I just think this is pretty interesting. This is Star of the South, which is a project that's being developed by Copenhagen Infrastructure Projects. Again, European money moving in and developing it. And one of the ways they developed this first off was they secured the rights to the transmission grid from the Loy-Yang coal plant, which is scheduled to close. And they have worked very, very hard to work with the former coal miners and workers and try and engage them in the process of thinking about this industry going forward. As you hear how they're thinking about it and all of the environmental approvals that would need to happen, all of the licensees that would need to be there, all of the authorizations that need to go forward, you appreciate that for this first generation of developers, these transaction costs are enormous. Currently, given today's technologies and Australia's rules, it's illegal to build offshore wind. But that will have to change if this is going to go forward. And the government has stated again and again that it wants this technology to work. So the different regulatory declarations going forward. And I mentioned before in this policy descriptions paper, this link, figure 8, risks of being dependent upon interstate energy imports. So the idea of importing electricity is seen as a more expensive option than developing a whole new offshore wind industry. This surprised me, but I can appreciate that the distances are large and the politics on transmission are very complicated. So across our different countries here in the Pacific region, Taiwan has almost 1 gigawatt installed. The others are planning in different stages. There's rapid regulatory transformations happening, there's stalled states, there's declared goals, but there's also a lot of contention and enthusiasm. And I will admit that prior to this talk, which I thought was happening last month, I hadn't known much about New Zealand and the offshore wind goals, but I've appreciated that you are right now in the process of creating your regulatory framework And understanding how the NBIE will be pushing this forward is a hot and real topic right now. So what I would love in our discussion period is to understand what is special about the New Zealand context for offshore wind development and how to think about this going forward. I'm happy to share any of the slides or any of the information or any of the papers I mentioned with you. That's my email, elizabeth@dartmouth.edu. And I'm hoping that you have a wonderful conference. I'm hoping that this gave you some sort of global image of the development of this promising yet challenging industry. And there was one question in the chat. Feel free, people online, to chat, but if you want to take some questions too, I'm happy to go forward that way also.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth. That's a very interesting survey of what's happening around the world. So questions from the floor. Oh, so we might start with the one online. So Chris Lambourne, how should New Zealand change its expectations with the recent failure of the UK government to allocate any offshore wind contracts in its latest renewable energy auction? So I guess it highlights the ongoing cost challenges and how should New Zealand change its policies to deal with this?
So Chris, I think this is a super interesting question, and this is one I've been following as well. What I have appreciated from talking to developers and people who've been involved in kind of gigawatt scale renewable projects in North America and overseas, you have to wait for the different pieces to line up correctly. And if you look at the new UK CFD requirements that are coming in at a much higher level, that's how they're trying to do it. So what we're trying to do is use different financial mechanisms to allow for the technology to be profitable. You see the same thing in New York. The PPAs that they had negotiated for a couple of developers weren't going to make viable projects. And so the developers have walked, they've issued new PPAs with higher rates. And those costs have been driven up, as I mentioned before, because of interest rates, the supply chain issues, and because of the kind of COVID disruptions to a lot of those supply chain issues. What's been interesting to watch in the US, the Ørsted project where they pulled out of New Jersey, Ocean One, when you looked at the earnings allocation call, one of the reasons they were pulling out was because they couldn't get a duplicative supply vessel because of our Jones Act, where all of the maritime boats and infrastructure, 500 million a pop, had to be built in the US. So because they weren't able to get that piece on time, it meant that they weren't able to earn enough on the project to go forward because of all the timing is being so strictly managed. So I think that what you're looking at in the development of any new industry, but especially one as complex, complicated, with so many moving parts as this one, is that you have to wait for the right time to be able to go forward and to be flexible enough, yet secure enough what makes sense to make it there. So I'm not sure how you build that in, but I do think there's an iterative institutional learning process that we're seeing happen around the world.
Thanks for that. We've got a question from the floor here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm an impact assessor. So
Can I see the speaker? Is it possible to move me around?
No.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi. I'm an impact assessor, and whilst not environmental impact, I'm in the social impact space. But when I look at the complexity and the scale of what you've sort of surveyed and summarized, I feel quite fearful. Only because I'm thinking about the I guess the cost. Whilst we know that it will generate energy into the future, I'm interested in the input, that the cost to the environment and the cost the energy used to develop up the industry.
So I think this is a super interesting question. I wanted to point you to a couple of researchers that you might find really interesting. There's Matilda Kreider, K-R-I-D-E-R. She works at the National Renewable Energy Lab, and she has just done a really nice survey of community benefit agreements for offshore wind. So you can see all of the North American projects and all of those agreements. Another researcher at University of Aberdeen, Paula Duffy, has been working with Scottish communities. Before that, she was the Maritime Spatial Planning with the Scottish government and really following that kind of community benefit component of this. And there was also a recent study that just came out looking at the area of Lancaster in the UK that had been a very, very economically depressed area. And when offshore wind came in, the jobs and kind of fortunes of a very depressed economic area changed in very different ways. Like I mentioned before, in North America, we don't have any practical experience there, but these projects are starting now. And as we've mentioned, as Chris's question kind of came forward, the industry is challenged there as well. I guess the way I think about this is that I don't think our current system is working too well for us. I mean, I spent my summer breathing smoke from the wildfires in Canada, and then Vermont flooded. I mean, we're living in a world that we've created with our very extreme emissions. We're burning more oil this year than ever before. Somehow we need to do something differently if we're going to survive this next few decades. And so I appreciate that every technology has trade-offs. And I'm really happy that the groups that are pushing the development of these industries, for the most part, at least in Northern Europe, have a very strong kind of environmental EIA background going forward. But I think ensuring that communities are part of this discussion is something that people are studying now. And I'm happy to make introductions to any of those people if you want to reach out to me.
Thanks for that, Elizabeth. It looks like you've just been invited to the New Zealand Offshore Wind Working Group.
Yes, I've always wanted to be part of that.
So any more questions from the floor here?
Thanks. We're in an interesting position in New Zealand where we do already have a lot of renewables, and building more has the potential to bring prices down a lot. And commercially, people aren't going to want to see that too much. So how do you see the future, for people like us, where you really want to overbuild some of these, but commercially it's not, an imperative? Or
one of the things I've appreciated by all energy system technologies over the last 20 years is it has to fit where you are. I mean, some technologies make sense in some places, and some make sense in places that you never think they will make sense. I mean, whoever thought that Germany would become a leader in solar, right? Or that Florida wouldn't. And yet you appreciate that this fit between the technology, the institution, the societal goals come together in configurations that if we were rational political actors, rational economic actors, wouldn't work that way. But instead, you see these opportunities happen, and different groups come together for the development of different industries that open up new possibilities. One of the pieces I have appreciated over the years is how a lot of our futures remain very, very imaginary. I showed you the picture of onshore wind and kind of what we thought versus what we got. If I showed you the picture of carbon capture and sequestration, it would look just the opposite. I did my dissertation on that back in 2004, and the aspirations of CCS were great. It was going to remove all the CO2. You'd be able to have, fossil fuels without emissions. There are some demonstration projects that are very useful, but by and large, they've remained PowerPoint plants or very expensive failed demonstration sites. So by no means do I think that this technology or any suite of technologies will happen unless we're able to develop those socio-technical energy systems or evolve them in a way where they make sense for what we're trying to do. And for the New Zealand case, I don't understand enough for what the contours are, what the cost constraints are, what the societal opportunities are going forward. I do appreciate your goals are some of the most aggressive in the world, and the risks and benefits of different technologies fit together in different ways there, but I'd love to learn more.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. In the interests of time, we're going to move on, but you've provided us with your email address, and it sounds like there's going to be ongoing discussions and interaction with you, which is exactly what we hoped would happen. So,
and you guys are all welcome if you want to come skiing this winter. We got snow.
We've got
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
No, thanks very much for that. And could we all thank Elizabeth again for her great talk?
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we would now move on to a bit more of a New Zealand focus. So we've got 3 talks in this next session. Well, first of all, why don't you all just stand up for a moment, just sort of stretch your legs a little bit, because we've been sitting around for a while. And as you're standing, I'll talk. Okay, so we're going to talk about regional transitions next. And that's really relevant to the wind energy discussion that we were just talking about. And so, yeah, you can sit down now. So our next speaker is actually Jonathan Young from OERC, and so he's the head of industry and government engagement there, and he's going to be talking to us about the Taranaki energy transition.
Well, I found that presentation by Elizabeth absolutely amazing. It's great to have somebody of her caliber who's had that experience and looked and researched through different countries to see what's currently happening. Last week, at the beginning of last week, I was actually at a conference in Barcelona. The European Commission have their annual, what's called Strategic Energy Technologies Conference. And I was in Europe, so at the time, went and participated in that conference, and everything that she said about Europe is just absolutely bang on, and that was just fresh off the press last week. So I think that we could connect very positively with Elizabeth as a great resource of information and trends that are happening around the world. Anyway, thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's fantastic to come down to Dunedin and from Taranaki. I'd have to say it's a bit chillier here than home, but that's probably to be expected. I'd like to talk about the Taranaki transition because a number of years ago, Taranaki was informed that we were going to be moving into a transition. It was announced by the government of the day back in April 2018. So just a fraction of time just for the history of OERC. We were a concept developed in 2016 when regional research institutes were set up. Didn't make the grade because the Minister of Economic Development at this time said Taranaki has got enough experience and funding through energy companies there to do it themselves. So we didn't get across the line for that. But interestingly enough, the concept was still there. Venture Taranaki developed it. And when the government announced that there would be no further offshore exploration permits granted, they looked at setting up OERC, which was at the time called the National New Energy Development Centre. That's a bit of a mouthful. OERC is a Maori term gifted to us from Taranaki iwi, essentially meaning an upward and onward path of aspiration, which I think is a great term. So this is our headquarters. We are based with 2 other energy companies looking at transition. So we have a facility there with about 50 people in the building. It's a fantastic vibe. So what I'd like to talk about is balancing the multiple priorities in energy transition, the Taranaki story. And there are different priorities that come in the energy transition. Of course, the number one reason is to reduce emissions, to transition so that we can go no more than 1.5 degrees across the globe, which is going to be a very challenging goal. In fact, that's an average. So there will be some countries that will probably hit 5 to 8 degrees and other countries less. So that is the goal in order to curb the environmental changes that are taking place, that are already in our lives. So looking at we know the energy trilemma around security, equity, sustainability. The transition trilemma is around scientific possibility, economic feasibility, and environmental and social benefit to people. And all of that, I think, will enable what's called a just transition. And so the transition in Taranaki, excuse me, and also Southland have identified those two regions as just transition regions, where the government have been very, very keen to ensure that the transitions in those regions where considerable change will take place will ensure that we get through it in a successful way, that people won't be left behind, communities won't be left behind, and that we continue to succeed. Taranaki's economy has, for many years, has been the highest GDP per capita in the country, and that's because there are very many successful energy companies based there. So what is the just transition? The just transition from Wikipedia as a general description is a framework developed by the trade union movement when there's industrial transition to ensure that people are retrained and there's opportunities for people going forward. And so the announcement that came in April 2018 was made with that lens to say, okay, we want to support a region that's going to transition rather than just close it down. It came as a massive shock to the Taranaki region. I kind of knew that something was up. And at the particular time, I was the MP for New Plymouth. And I had, after the 2017 election, pulled all the energy companies in and said, and, I was in the opposition then with the National Party. And I said, just going through the manifestos of the Green Party and the Labour Party, you can expect change. Change is going to be fast coming. And this was in November. So in April, the following April, the announcement was made. And it was a shock to many people, but it wasn't a shock to me, because I knew that that was on the agenda, and it was publicised in manifestos back in 2017. So Venture Taranaki kind of picked up some work. So I've just had a sign to say 5 minutes. Have I gone for 10 minutes already? Because I want to now jump through to the economic impact that was quite significant. NZIE did a report, so that probably got a lot of people in Taranaki quite concerned and quite worried. Back in 2011, the Maori pipeline leaked, had a fracture in it, and for 138 hours was out of commission. It cost the economy $20 million, which indicates the value stream that natural gas enabled the economy to earn, and this was all kind of northwards of Taranaki. So the government said we need to find out a little bit more about that in case that pipeline was to completely disappear through a landslip, for a large section of it. And so Wally did a report to say that if there was a complete disruption, then over a period of months, $650 million would be lost to the economy. So I say that as an indication of what the value stream is from that resource going north up into Waikato, Auckland, those different places across to the Bay of Plenty. So the prospect of that industry having an accelerated close down caused a lot of concern in the Taranaki region. The government ran a Just Transition Conference, and then Venture Taranaki ran a process to look at what the future would look like in 2050. But this graph is from MBIE's website, and what it's shown is what the production was and what the consumption was from natural gas. And what it's shown is that from 2023 or 4 onwards, there's a significant decline. And that is essentially because investment has been withheld. because companies don't want to have stranded assets. They don't want to put hundreds of millions of dollars in. It's around about $200 million a year to maintain that system. And that started to get, that started to get the government concerned. So the transition in Taranaki was announced and finance dried up straight away. Employers stopped employing people straight away because they knew that in time, viability was going to be a question. So if I can just jump to the, in my last couple of minutes, the recent series of discussion documents the government have put out. One of them is the gas transition plan. And what they are wanting to put in place is a more orderly reduction of natural gas in the economy. And they want to do it so there's going to be enough confidence to invest, to maintain supply, so that companies like Fonterra don't pour out milk on paddocks as they had to do when that gas pipeline outage occurred back in 2011. And so that the economy wouldn't dive and struggle, because we've got to understand that the transition is reasonably expensive. And we won't get there if regions and the economy suffers incredibly. So the view, I think, of MB coming out of this last year is that we need to actually have an orderly transition. If I go to here, this one here, this is what the Climate Change Commission say: the speed with which Aotearoa reduces fossil gas use for generating electricity needs to be carefully managed to ensure electricity remains reliable and affordable. And in the emissions reduction plan that came out, the first one, it said an orderly reduction in natural gas use is really, really important. So maybe just a finishing comment now before we come to any questions. I've got 1 minute. Is that I think transitional thinking has matured in Taranaki. I think people understand that we've got a goal to achieve, but getting there in a way in which we support the economy, support industry, support jobs is incredibly important. I guess these slides will be available. So that is the emissions from other fuels compared to natural gas. That is a table that the government provided to the Environmental Select Committee. So you can trust those figures. The Taranaki 2050 roadmap has established a whole lot of goals and ideals, and that was started by Venture Taranaki. 7,000 people participated in that. So that set a target for our region. And I'm pleased to say that if I just quickly jump to this point here, the offshore renewables ecosystem is developing in Taranaki. And I'm involved in some coordination in that particular area. We see opportunities for new jobs. We are running annual conferences. Our fourth one is coming up. We have 200 plus people coming in. Yes, there's a lot of European interest, but also Australia, also USA as well. And we are developing what a future could look like for us. We're wanting to help companies who build this sort of stuff, which is an undersea restaurant in the Maldives, built by Fitzroy Engineering, to build this sort of stuff. And so we're connecting those companies with those providers of floating and offshore technologies. There's a whole lot of componentry that can be built locally. So plans are in play. And I've finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So questions from the audience?
John, thanks for that. What's your position, or the National Party's position, on bipartisanship agreement going forward with enabling offshore wind?
I think it's a good thing to have bipartisanship because these projects are obviously longer than electoral cycles. When Megan Woods was the minister and I was the energy spokesperson, I'd often say to her, what we should do. We should develop bipartisan thinking around the space, because there will be things that you don't agree with and I don't agree with, but it's so important for our country, and it's decadal in terms of investment and building, that we need to be thinking beyond electoral cycles.
What about National's idea they're going to reopen up the offshore, the fuel and gas industries?
I think National always had the view that MB have now come to, that it's better to manage it for security supply and affordability rather than just for commercial benefit. And so I've had discussions with people from all parties to say, if you are going to open this up, then it needs to be for a reason that New Zealand will support. And it needs to be for a time until there's an adequate replacement for that energy source, or companies can adjust to other types of energy.
Hi, Sally over here.
Hi, Sally.
Just a wee question around ownership of these new renewable resources like your offshore wind, with all the interest from overseas. I guess in terms of security of energy supply, how do you see the balance of effectively taxpayer-owned versus offshore company-owned generation evolving?
I guess it's appetite for risk, because as Elizabeth was saying, there's considerable challenges and people will walk away. It's very, very complex. So my involvement in the offshore renewable space is that I convene a group of people that is largely community leadership, mayoral forums, iwi leaders, assets owned by the community, such as the port, to say, okay, what is the compelling case for this to continue? What do we need to do to support it if we believe there is a compelling case? What's the need for off-takers, knowing that, for example, offshore Taranaki can kind of get 2 gigawatts onto the grid at a cost of about $1 billion of upgrade? Who's going to pay for that? That's a discussion they are having with Transpower. And what we're doing is that we are wanting to ensure that the resident community benefits from this, as well as, I guess, is, obviously those companies need to be profit-making companies. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it in the first place. Another question. Yeah.
Hi, Jonathan. Bill Curry from Powerhouse Wind. I'd just like to say that we've had some incredibly intelligent and useful support from Ariake. I know it's New Plymouth focused. What do you think the chances are of spreading that model further into the country? Because I think it's working very well, and it's a very, very smart way to go.
Thanks, Bill. And congratulations too from the other day for your company. We are a national focused agency. We are created and supported by the government, but we are independent. We have our own board, and we operate all around the country. So we're not Taranaki based, even though we do obviously work on Taranaki based projects. So that's the model that we are pursuing. We do have part of our team in Auckland. We have a single person in Wellington, and the rest are in New Plymouth. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much again. Thanks, Jonathan. Sorry for the short time you got to speak. Okay, so the next speaker we have is Mike Shatford, and he's online. Is that right? No, sorry, Steve. Sorry, Steve Canny is coming up next from Great South, New Zealand. So he's the Business and Strategic Projects Group Manager, and also Chair of the New Zealand Hydrogen Council. Yep.
Right. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, apologies for not being here yesterday. life has been a little bit busy of late, to be honest. Look, wonderful speakers this morning, which is outstanding. I guess the angle that I'm taking is very much a decarbonisation pathway being the driver of decision making. I'll just point out, I'm going to talk about the decarbonisation and the inextricable link to renewable energy planning in particular. Just a couple of facts about our region. One is we produce 11.7% of New Zealand's agricultural exports. We produce 8.1% of the manufactured goods within the region. 70% of our GDP is focused on exports. We have the highest export value of any region in New Zealand. We're highly geared, relatively small population of 103,900 or thereabouts. And we cover about 12% of the land area of New Zealand. 58% of that is actually national park, which is a great thing. Unfortunately, we're in the top 2 in terms of emissions as a region, very high emissions. For our economy to remain globally competitive, one, we have to be taking proactive action on decarbonisation because high value market access will be affected by that. And efficacy is a very important part of all productive systems of value-added processing, and customer choices preferring low emissions production. So very important for us. We have to ensure that energy is affordable going forward, and low carbon added value is essential. I'll have to whistle through this fairly quickly for you today, unfortunately. Oops, where are we? So our pathway is very much, this is our 4th energy strategy as a region. We started in 2002, 2005 and 2011. And we anticipated many of the problems and challenges we have today. And as a consequence of that, we've invested in robust investment in our Lower South Island renewables grid, and Transpower kindly have committed 138 million or thereabouts to strengthen that grid to contemplate renewables. Just set the scene, 8 billion tonnes of accessible coal in Southland. Big challenge for us, 187 boilers, commercial boilers, most have been fuels. So a big transition for us is completely transforming our energy future. So we did a piece of work in 2021, which basically identified that we could achieve carbon neutrality with a reasonable NPV return by 2050, provided everybody tackled this challenge, and we could transition our emissions very significantly. I'll talk about that right at the end. What I would say is the big part of planning, a bit like what Jonathan said, you have to involve everybody in the planning process. Don't worry about the detail. It's a fine detail there. But what I would say right from the outset, iwi have to be around the table and all other stakeholders have to be there also, including infrastructure owners, generators, et cetera, et cetera. The other really important part of having any kind of strategic planning process, and we're talking about fairly robust strategic planning processes. There's 21 technical papers in our report. They're detailed, bankable technical inputs. I'm pleased to say that 17 of those have come out of our science and engineering team within my team, which is great. Look, I've touched on that. I won't touch anything more. We've navigated our decarbonisation pathway via agriculture and technology pathways, only bankable technologies that are available now. And we've, I'll just quickly show you this. I guess the context generally is that we have unprecedented demand for energy in all of its forms. Energy efficiency we can't avoid. We have to ensure that we're efficient users. The main energy sources that we're looking at as a region is electricity, biomass, and biogenic methane recovery to substitute for natural gas. I won't get into that too much more other than to simply say, before you tackle this kind of transition, you've got to really know the metrics around the challenges. That big red blob there is thermal energy in our emissions across our region. And so that's been our first target. and I won't go into it too much detail, other than to say the agricultural pathway doesn't involve converting productive land to carbon forest. And I'm not talking about that today, but I can give you a song and verse on the impacts on that. We rather prefer planting riparian marginal lands and within the conservation estate. As I mentioned, 58% of our land mass is conservation estate, but the Conservation Act doesn't allow us to plant permanent carbon native forests in our conservation estate. So the Conservation Act allows us to grow pest weeds and not manage that terribly well, not grow biodiversity. Incidentally, 30% of New Zealand's total land area is conservation estate. So we have to make some changes. I love the bipartisan approach. This is long and enduring stuff. You need to have a good foundation. The other technology path is really about decarbonisation of boilers, reducing transport emissions, dealing with waste from landfills, and so on and so forth. That big step on the diagram here is what would happen if Tiwai smelter leaves the region. We'd step down around 680,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, and then as well as the electricity-based emissions. Of course, we don't want that to happen. It's a world-leading organisation in its own right, and it's low carbon aluminium is sought internationally. It does use 13% of our energy though, and it serves a really important role of stabilising our lightly loaded New Zealand grid. So one of the really key messages I'd like to get across is that if you're looking at demand side, get granular, get right down to looking at what the decarbonisation load by site is. Look at your transport demand and load. Look at your transport system. Look at weight restricted bridges and what the impacts are of that. In our region, we travel 3.6 million more kilometres because we have weight restricted bridges. So you've got to invest in your transport and efficient transport networks. Look at new industry investment and what that demand is, and look at electricity efficiency gains. That should always be the first thing in actual fact. So for us, we currently use around 940 megawatts. We had a woody biomass market of 200,000 tonnes. That has to move to 550,000 tonnes. 550,000 tonnes very quickly, and we have a need to substitute LPG with biogenic methane from waste ponds mostly, and we've done quite a lot of work in this area. So just for us going forward, this is our demand and supply curve. What I would say is that I won't get into it too much other than simply say we have an immediate identified need for another 12 to 1,300 megawatts of new generation. And there is some good news. I guess in practical sense, from an energy perspective, intermittent energies on a lightly loaded grid is a really big problem. Very unstable. You have to have good base load to manage that. So we feel that run-of-river hydro does have to be looked at again in a New Zealand context, and maybe in some of the modified river systems, such as the Clutha, as an example. But we also think that demand management and peak load management for EDBs, electricity distribution boards, etc., will be critically important. And I guess in practical sense, generation has to be ideally close to demand to get network grid efficiencies, but doesn't have to be locally. And I think when you're looking at investment and making sure that prices remain stable, you've got to have a really good balance between the potential for new energy as well as the demand. One, the demand identifies and provides a business case for investment. Two, for the people investing in energy use, they want to see reliable supply. Doesn't, of course, have to be local, but it's good to put it on the table. So for us, our approach has been very much to model all of the run-of-river options in the Lower South Island, and including dam structures and inundation and all of those